The next section of protists that we're going to talk about are the fungus-like protists. Now, she doesn't spend a lot of time on these fungus-like protists, and the reason is probably twofold. One is that in the second part of the chapter that I mentioned before, I've actually separated it out, and we're going to cover it separately. When we talk about the kingdom fungi, we're going to spend a lot of time on organisms that are very similar to these. The other reason why I'm curious if maybe she didn't spend a lot of time on it was simply because there's just a lot of disagreement as to how some of the organisms that are placed in this particular category are classified to begin with. Again, the last textbook, that biology textbook that I taught out of, that particular textbook classified these organisms in kingdom fungi as opposed to putting them into kingdom protista. So just be aware that, again, that if you take biology again later on, these organisms may be classified in a different location. All right, so the fungus-like protists, their feeding habits are to be decomposers. They're going to be feeding on dead material and breaking it down, returning it to the environment. So there are basically two main types of these fungus-like protists. One is the slime molds, and one are the water molds and mildew. So if we look at the slime molds can then further be broken down into either cellular or acellular types. Now, the cellular types are individual cells, and then when the food supply starts to get low and survival becomes a little bit more difficult, they start to aggregate together as a colony. I mean, we talked about before how single-celled creatures will do this. They will aggregate together and work as a colony, work as a group for survival. It doesn't mean that they're a multicellular organism. It just means that it's a bunch of single cells all working together. So when these single cells begin to aggregate, when the food gets low, then they kind of move around as a group to obtain food. If the food supply issue doesn't change, then these same cells will begin to send out fruiting bodies, and then they will produce spores and reproduce. And then spores are such that they have a hard protective coat around them and can almost lie dormant for a while until they find a suitable place where they can then sprout is the wrong word because that's the one we use for seed, but the spores will then come back and become a functioning organism once again. So the cellular ones look a lot like a large amoeba when they're feeding. The acellular ones, again, similar type of situation. They are also individual cells, and when food supply gets low, they actually fuse into one large multinucleated cell. And again, it kind of looks like an amoeba when it feeds. And so just like when we talked about amoebas and we talked about protozoans, they are using pseudopods to obtain their food, but they are reproducing by using spores. And so when they feed, they almost look like the protozoans, but when they reproduce, they do look a lot more like organisms in kingdom fungi, and kingdom fungi are all going to reproduce by spores. But we'll talk a lot more about kingdom fungi when we hit that part of the chapter later. The other type of the fungus-like protists are the water molds and mildews. And your water molds are individual cells that, again, are going to fuse to form a multinucleated cell, kind of like the acellular slime molds did, but instead of one large multinucleated cell, they actually form hyphae. And hyphae are these long filaments of cells. And we'll talk a whole lot more about hyphae when we talk about kingdom fungi. And then you also have mildews, and these guys are the ones that are going to grow on land. So again, not a whole lot of detail that we're going to go into about these fungus-like slime molds. Really, the main important things to remember are that when they fuse together, they look an awful lot like amoeba when they feed, and they are going to reproduce by spores. They are heterotrophic decomposers.